Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Dean Orrico from Middlefield, and I'm really happy to have Dr. Richard Evans from SSR Health. Richard and I have been working together since we launched our first healthcare fund in 2014, and we're really happy to have him alongside us because, as you'll gather through today's webinar, that Richard provides an abundance of information on a sector that can be abundantly complicated. And healthcare is one of these areas where we really do believe active management makes a lot of sense. And we offer actively managed funds, both in a mutual fund as well as an ETF format. And there's been a lot of moving parts in the healthcare sector, maybe more in the last 12 months than we've seen for some time, although it always is a sector with a lot of moving parts. And we've now been in a cadence of having regular updates. So Richard's in Toronto today, and we're meeting with a bunch of clients throughout the day, but we thought we'd kick it off with this live webinar. And I'm going to really dig into some of the more topical issues that are impacting the healthcare industry. And at the end of the day, Richard, we know that this has been a sector that's certainly had some challenges in the last 12 months. As I mentioned, there's a number of moving parts. But perhaps at a high level, how would you describe the opportunity in healthcare today, taking into account, where we are from a valuation standpoint, both relative to the broader market as well as healthcare historically?
Yeah, I think valuations clearly are low, both in absolute and relative terms. Point one. And point two, there's a lot of volatility and uncertainty in the broader market and in the broader economy. And investors typically turn to healthcare for its defensive utility, which is genuine. And the fundamental foundation of that is just consistent, reliable, inelastic demand and demand growth. And that's something. So there are elements of demand within healthcare that it just reliably grow independent of the economic cycle. And that's something, investors have turned to again and again. And I believe there's been a fair bit of noise around healthcare that has made that a bit of a weaker rotation than it has been in the past. But by selecting the right stocks and selecting the right subsectors, we can still access that inelastic demand and demand growth. And again, and also good, steady dividend-paying companies that truly fits in with their mandate.
Yeah, because we're at a point now where the sector is really trading at a substantial discount to the broader market. We know the broader market, as you alluded, has had quite a bit of volatility, and there's been some issues in healthcare, which I think are really creating this attractive backdrop, maybe as attractive as I've seen it in the last 10 years when you think about where healthcare is today in terms of this inelastic demand, as well as some of the opportunities in growth and innovation.
Right. Yeah. One of the interesting things about healthcare, if you look at over very long time cycles, a lot of industries have this notion of mean reversion, right? So you buy when it's expensive and you're in trouble because it's going to come down, or conversely, you buy when it's cheap and that's all good because it goes up. And these cycles are reliable in a lot of sectors. It's not so true in healthcare. And one of the key reasons is regulation and legislation. And we've seen that, right, with the One Big Beautiful Bill. We saw that in the Biden administration with the Inflation Reduction Act. And so you get a lot of, the market hand, if you will, gets disrupted along the way pretty frequently within healthcare. And so, as you know, we spend a lot of time in DC, we spend a lot of time in the States. And so we can generally see these things coming, anticipate them. We've been involved in, working with Congress on and the administration, on some of these. And so we can largely steer around those. It takes some patience because a lot of generalists, when they see that, healthcare, either broadly or individual subsectors, are teed up for regulation or legislation, they just kind of put them on the side because it is very complex and difficult to understand. But we do spend a lot of time with government regulatory agencies, so I think we are largely able to steer around those.
Well, let's touch on the various areas of the portfolio where we have exposure. And one of the areas where we're currently underweighted is managed care, because there's a real regulatory impact on managed care, and in particular, the Medicare Advantage area,
Yeah.
which is really an area that caters to older Americans, but is really funded by plans as opposed to be directly from the federal government. And the plans basically receive funding from the federal government, which this year turned out to be about 2.5%, was initially indicated that would be no increase over last year. So at least they're getting 2.5%. In your view, this more modest increase of 2.5 relative to what they got in last year, what was announced last year for 2026, how do you think that's impacting the managed care players like a UNH or CVS? Does this impact their margins? Because this has been an area which we know has had some challenges in the last 12 to 24 months.
Yeah, so it's absolutely going to impact margins in the short to medium term. But over the longer term, I think that the Medicare Advantage margins are quite good. So just very broadly, what's happening is most seniors are in Medicare Advantage instead of the traditional fee-for-service, go to your doctor and the bill gets paid type of thing. And what's happened is Medicare Advantage fees are indexed off of fee-for-service patients, but there's so few of the fee-for-service patients that the index is kind of broken down. And there's this broad realization, bipartisan, that the fees being paid in Medicare Advantage have grown pretty quickly. So freeze-frame that. Also, especially on the Republican side, there's a belief that Medicare Advantage is the way to go. Having the market in healthcare for seniors is the right way. So they don't want to kill it. They want it to work. They actually want it to expand. So this this year's rate is a logical resetting. What the plans will do, they've been making enough money that they can give either these Silver Sneakers programs, for example. If you sign up for Medicare Advantage, you get free gym memberships. You get a lot of perks. Those perks are going to go away. And still, when you think about, turning 65 and where I'm going to go, most of the options put before you are Medicare Advantage plans that people are going to go to them. So they may not have the gym membership. They may not have the subsidized, heavily subsidized dental or things like that, but they're still going to go. So the overall, ticket per beneficiary will shrink a bit. The benefits per beneficiary, the non-medical,
Perks, if you will.
The perks, exactly, are going to come out, but they're going to have to come out everywhere. Mm-hmm. So it's not this difficult decision of, hey, do you and I, if we're running planned, we hang on to those perks, or do we let them go? Yeah, everybody's going to let those go. So the margins will recover. It's a logical reset. The payment rates got ahead of themselves.
Okay, that's helpful to appreciate that, because there's been lots of noise around some of those managed care players, like, as I say, as a UNH, for all kinds of reasons.
I should say I own Humana, full disclosure, and bought it when the 0.9 came out, because I just never thought that would be the final print. And knowing the Republicans want this broader, MA environment or ecosystem to succeed, Humana is a pure play there.
And we also own Humana in the fund for the same reason. So that's turning out to be a really good move. Just continuing on managed care, it's been about 10 months since the new healthcare bill passed. A lot of cost-cutting measures in there. But based on what you're seeing so far, like how many people are enrolling, how much healthcare they're using, how many bills are going unpaid, what's the real world impact of this formula, which doesn't seem to be abided by currently by the government and those running the healthcare?
Yeah. So the other side of I also hate calling it one of the beautiful bill acts. I noticed you call it the Healthcare Act.
Yes.
Let's just use that.
Yeah.
So the other side of it is really Medicaid, the program for the poor. And again, this fits into the Republicans' ideological framing of less of a welfare state. They've squeezed Medicaid very, very hard. So Medicaid is a program for the poor. A lot of hospitals, especially rural hospitals, are incredibly dependent on Medicaid. So the payment rates are not growing. The number of people covered is shrinking. So if you're running a smaller rural hospital, there's a fairly good chance that you're going to go out of business. Hospitals it's incredible how much pain they can suffer before they close the doors. So some you just have the foresight to just kind of shut down. It's created a lot of local controversy in these communities. Others are going to ride it out and have to shut down along the way. Most of these are nonprofits, right? Very few of these are going to be in the for-profit hospitals, but those patients are going to go without care. So on a human level, the impact is tremendous, tremendously negative. But in terms of our portfolio, I hate to say it doesn't matter because so many people are being negatively affected, but it's not an impact on our investment portfolio.
Okay. Switching gears here a little bit to pharma. And you can't really talk about pharma without talking about GLP-1s, which I think we'd all agree may be the most impactful new drugs introduced in decades. And having said that, in 2026, we've got Lilly, who's clearly the market leader, down 20%, Novo down by a similar amount. How do you see the GLP-1 market evolving now that, it's certainly been on the scene for at least the last 3 or 4 years as far as obesity goes? How do you think this is going to go, especially when you think about these two leading players?
Yeah, so there are really 3 things happening to summarize. So the obesity targeted GLP-1 brands are really a lot more expensive than the ones that are used every day in type 2 diabetes, but they're the same molecule. So there's an arbitrage, and the market is taking advantage of that arbitrage. And so you're seeing a collapse from the really high obesity prices down to the type 2 diabetes prices. And that was always going to happen. And we've been writing about that for years. And I think most investors understood that pretty well. The second thing that's happening is we're coming out with orals. And so people who are needle phobic, or even if you're not needle phobic, right? So look, I need to lose 5 pounds or 10 pounds. I'm not going to inject myself to do that. Now I'm going to take a pill every day and we get there. So that is really going to expand total unit volume to GLP-1s. They're going to be less expensive than the current GLP-1s. So we're going to have some price deflation on average. But that's okay because these products, the oral products are still very profitable at the prices at which they'll be sold. They're much easier to make than the sterile injectables that have been the mainstay of the market so far. And then finally, there are a lot of patients that are still out of reach of GLP-1s because they're just not effective enough, as effective as they are. So Lilly can get about 60% of the population, obese and overweight population, to a target. Novo can only get about 48% with their portfolio. I think Lilly is likely to leverage
because they've got a more narrow portfolio, Richard.
Actually, they have. So both companies have both oral and injectable. It's just that the Lilly injectable is so much more powerful. And so what they have the opportunity to do is just go into a health plan and say, hey, look, we'll give you really good pricing if you buy only our GLP-1s, both for diabetes and obesity. And if you don't, you're just going to have to pay the rack rate. And the rack rate is really high, especially on the most powerful injectable. That's a really tough thing for Novo to work against because if we're the health plan, we know that, there's 12% of patients that we're targeting, or we can get 12% more of the population to go on the Lilly portfolio than the Novo portfolio. If we buy the Novo portfolio cheap by just only using Novo, we still got to go out and pay this really high rack rate for Zepbound, the more powerful Lilly product. And hey, the math doesn't work. So let's just go over here and buy the Lilly.
And stay without one Lilly portfolio for all these stratas of various patients.
Yeah. So I think the market is evolving from, hey, we'll cover both. Because remember the shortage, right? We had shortages of these molecules. So as planned, you can't just say, hey, I'm just going to use a Lilly portfolio or the Novo portfolio. You basically had to let patients enroll in whatever was available for them because they were gating new patients, manufacturers gating new patients into the market. That restraint is gone. And so I think the natural evolution of this market is to one in which you're either a Lilly shop or you're a Novo shop. And Lilly has a big advantage in converting even your mixed users or Novo shops over their spot.
And it's for that rationale that we actually have a significant weight in Lilly. We continue to believe in that story, just based on some of these macro factors and how we think this market is going to evolve over time.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Let's talk a little bit about AI. This is the one area that we believe is going to be impactful in terms of driving innovation and growth, product flow. And, we're seeing AI in drug discovery, clinical development, medical devices, just to name a few. And 2026 really being the beginning of readouts for AI designed drugs. How much do you think, Richard, this is going to drive change in the industry? And similarly, what do you think the long-term view is on AI designed drugs?
So I think it's going to drive a tremendous amount of change. So when you think about the drug development cycle, most of the uncertainty is at the beginning and most of the spending is at the end. So in the beginning, you're trying to match a technology to a somewhat amorphously defined endpoint. So you understand the disease, but that disease doesn't live in isolation. It lives in this big complex thing called a human being. And when you go in and start interfering with that, you get a lot of off-target effects. And there's so much that you don't know when you start putting molecules into, test tube systems or mammalian systems or ultimately humans.
We're talking preclinical trial.
Preclinical, yeah. I mean, back in the test tube, we're designing things. And so we see in the data that manufacturers commit the wrong products to late stage testing pretty frequently, and they don't know it until they get to late stage testing. And when you dissect those and look backwards, it's 2020 hindsight, right? But you start to see some consistent patterns of, hey, if we had just known this, then we wouldn't have this cardiovascular side effect, or we'd be able to get the dosing frequency down or the side effects down. And so AI is really good at, instead of, whereas today in the lab, we're kind of focused just on that disease process. AI is able to take a much broader view, look at sort of a whole human as a system, and also apply all this prior knowledge in every sort of future decision. So picking the right product before you put it into these hundreds of millions of dollars of commitments, if not billions of dollars of commitments for human testing, is absolutely key, because you can only afford to be testing so many products in humans at a given time, and the failure rates are high. And if you can lower that, then the economic return for lowering the failure rate of the products you put in humans is redefining for industrial productivity in biopharma.
And this year we've seen various biopharma companies, GSK, Pfizer, et cetera, launch kind of and as well as literally platform AI deals. Are these the ones that you think are at the forefront, or is this happening throughout the whole biopharma sector?
I've got mixed feelings about that. To me, aren't you just using Claude, or are you just using ChatGPT, or are you using Gemini? You do a ring fence deal with any of those.
Is it a privacy issue? Is it proprietary data info?
That's the ring fence, right? And so one of my brother-in-law is a PI on a NASA project. His entire team has ring fence access to ChatGPT, so they can put data into it, interact with it, teach it, evolve it, and it's all theirs, right? All the proprietary data belongs to NASA. You could do the same thing for a large pharmaceutical company. So, when I see, Roche buy, 1,000 NVIDIA chips or whatever, it's great, so you're applying AI, I understand that, but are you really able to evolve AI as fast as Anthropic or OpenAI? And I think the answer is plainly no. So, I think it's early days.
So why do you think they've done these deals with outside of the large LLMs? Why do you think they've done them with some smaller players?
I don't know, unless the larger LLMs are, and they've got some, software, partnerships with the larger LLMs, so they're, just hanging back, and they've got relatively, modest uses of AI that they don't need, the gigantic LLMs and that evolution. But and you're getting my biases here, right? I think that's short-sighted. The notion that, hey, this element of AI is grown enough that we can buy 1,000 NVIDIA chips and just, operate it privately internally. I think that's a rotary phone in a year.
Interesting. On the med tech side, this is arguably one of the areas where the impact of AI is probably most underrated. When we think about imaging, diagnostics. Do you think this is more of a future story? Do you think sometime in the next 12, 24 months, we might start seeing some real benefits of AI in these medtech businesses that we own in the fund?
Yeah, we're already seeing it. AI intervention in surgery is generally classified in 6 different levels, from zero to 5. So 0 would just kind of watching, and it tells you about, how you did later. 1 would be more, okay, hey, surgeon, you set the path for this trocar to go through the patient, but I'll drive it. That's more level 2. Level 1 would be, you're a little shaky on the hand control. Everybody's a little shaky on the hand control. I understand where, sort of the frequency of your shaking, and I'm going to filter that out.
AI can help filter out that shakiness of the surgeon on that ISRG
Today. Right.
Really interesting.
So yeah, and we've talked about neurosurgery before, which is not ISRG is more thoracic abdominal. Other companies are doing neuro, but we've talked about the need for sub-millimeter precision in neuro. It's the difference between patient being paralyzed or not paralyzed, conscious or unconscious, speaking or not speaking, and so surgeons are proud, but if you can filter out a little tremor, when I'm dissecting around spinal cord, yeah, I'll take it.
Mhm. And are all the major robotics players, for example, incorporating that into the current technology?
It's going to be more on the neuro side, I think, than on the thoracic abdominal, where you're kind of bigger.
Right.
The exception will be, when you're getting
Where you need to be a bit more, so much more specific on the neuro side, right? To your point.
absolutely right.
You can be maybe a millimeter, 2 millimeters off on the thoracic side potentially.
Yeah. Yeah, but on thoracic abdominal, back to the throat, things like that. The beauty of that when you're using a trocar, like just a long tube that you can pass instruments or cameras down, you've got to, that journey's not risk free, right? Getting that trocar down to where it needs to be. So the surgeon can decide the path, and the robot can basically travel that path for the benefit of AI. Those things help. Augmented reality, allowing me to see blood flow, visually, in the visual field, and navigate around, and things like that are already.
Just going back to clinical trials, we know this is another area where AI has been an important theme, and we know one of the challenges with clinical trials is patient enrollment. And we know AI-driven patient satisfaction using their electronic health records is now becoming more important. Are you finally starting to see that translate into more efficient and higher quality clinical trials?
Not yet. It's the thing about, just statistically, in order for these trials to be valid, you need to do them across multiple centers. And as you can imagine, getting multiple centers to adopt a new approach is a bit challenging. And you're doing this not just in North America, you're doing them all over the world now. So the short answer is yes, it's happening, but to me, it's just not a redefining thing for the way trials are done. If I want to recruit 10,000 patients with atrial fibrillation that meet certain criteria, then I'm basically financing, a research assistant to be in that local area and to qualify these patients. I think where AI can help is kind of getting out and finding these patients rather than just waiting for them to walk through the door. But we're already doing chart reviews and things like that. So it is absolutely helpful. It does make it more efficient, but I don't see it as a transformative change.
So in other words, some of our core holdings like Thermo Fisher are, definitely a major player within that clinical trial setting, and that wet lab experimentation phase. You don't think there's going to be less demand for Thermo Fisher products as a result of clinical trials potentially being more efficient or fewer of them?
Not at all. No, not at all. In fact, I've done a lot of venture capital work around AI assisted drug development, and you see proposals, you can then have either two characteristics, either in silico or in silico and in vitro. It just means in silico is just you're not doing any wet lab. In silico and vitro, you're iterating, and you're going back to the wet lab and testing and then coming back.
Oh, so it's even more iterative process here and more wet lab as a result.
Yeah, so Thermo Fisher is inside these good AI drug development ventures, selling products just like they're selling, to a more traditional drug development approach. I don't think it. No, so it's in order to go from concept to human, you need those consumables. You're not going to be doing any less of it. It's just that your failure rate on those projects is likely to be lower. But you're doing as many of them as you can afford. You just need to be picking. You need to be picking those. We're talking baseball before, right? You need to be even that kid in high school. Do you really know if he's good or not? You start recruiting now. You're just going to be a lot smarter about that stuff.
Yeah,
you're still going to have to do all the
moneyballing it to the next level. Really.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah,
perfect.
Yeah.
You landed it.
And like on Thermo, it's a really interesting story because that stock has been such a core holding for us really since we launched this strategy over 10 years ago. And like a lot of various parts of the market, they've been impacted by this sentiment that AI will be truly disruptive. And understanding from your perspective, what you're actually seeing on the ground, in fact, this probably be a boost to Thermo, is not what the market is actually perceiving today based on this superficial notion that AI is really going to displace the need for more Thermo Fisher models.
I spent many of the early years of my career on what we call the portfolio management board, where we looked at every project, that got into the portfolio, so sort of after test tube, right? Anything that was getting into mammalian testing, animal testing, all the way through humans. And the notion that we would do less of that is silly to me. The notion that would be more efficient is correct, but the efficiency is not that we would be studying, doing fewer animal tests or doing fewer human tests. It's just that we'd be doing them on projects that are more likely to succeed.
And doing more projects as a result because we have a higher view of succeeding.
That's correct. Yeah. So there's this curve Scott and I published years ago about portfolio capacity as a function of failure rate. And if you can fail early, you really increase your throughput because you think about it. If you follow that high school kid all the way through and put him on the pitcher's mound and he's just no good, then all the people
you've missed all along the way. Right. And then different analogy, but in the healthcare sector, you're really spending so much money as you realize late that you've actually missed this.
Yeah, and the companies have a really bad habit of just not accepting that and just pressing it through to just a bigger failure than it had to be. So yeah, AI is going to make drug development more efficient, not more efficient in the fact that you're going to spend less money per good project. You're just going to waste less money on bad projects.
Right. Interesting. Good way to frame it. Biotech, we know biotech really lives at the end of the spectrum where the risk reward can be more extreme as far as other healthcare sectors go. How would you describe the current state of biotech in terms of innovation, regulatory framework, opportunity generally?
Yeah, so I think, as you know, I'm a big believer in new product flow, and the broad sort of economic reason is the biopharma industry has always grown as a function of two variables: pricing power and new product flow. Pricing power is gone. We haven't had that any.
And you would know because you really develop probably the most well-accepted pricing data in the industry.
That's our main line of business. And so we haven't seen net price growth in more than 8 years. Every single quarter in real terms have been negative, in nominal terms, 3 quarters have been basis points.
Just on that, do you see any change in that as you look forward the next 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, I think it eases. So I think one of the things that happened is a lot of these policies that plan sponsors and managed care threw at pharma, they of course threw at the biggest categories first, right? So you're just hitting these really big categories, just have really big sales weights in our index, create negative net prices, and that obviously takes the whole average down. Now, these pricing techniques are being applied at birth of the product and birth of the new category. So rather than seeing price drops, you're just seeing more tepid price growth, sort of in line with CPI. So I think the equilibrium here is going to be that we see circa CPI growth in net price over time. And right now we're in a negative basis points kind of territory, but I do think it will be positive circa CPI. But just getting back to biotech opportunities, I think they are definitely early adopters on AI. You have fewer corporate constraints, fewer just sort of ideological constraints, less bureaucracy. They're just early adopters by nature.
More opportunistic, more nimble.
Absolutely.
Prepared to take on more risk.
Absolutely, yeah. So they spend less time in HR meetings and more time in the lab, and they just get it done. So the AI is just great for biotech. Pharma has always, pharma now is like the movie studio, and biotech is great. So you need that talent. Brad Pitt's not going to finance these things and, do the production and, hire the catering crew and things like that. You need a studio for that. That's kind of the ecosystem. The large cap pharmas are the movie studio. They do a reasonably good job. They get a lot better of picking, good actors or good scripts and working them through. You're going to get a lot of really good scripts from biotech. And because that ecosystem is set up where, Pfizer, Merck, Lilly, and all these guys should be doing their innovation, there are most of what they're finding that works their way through the system is coming from the outside. And we've also seen a lot of acquisition lately. And the risk is always, somebody does, you have a trial that kind of blows things up, the BSX thing that you I've talked about a lot. You do get these dents in investor sentiment, but that's a very idiosyncratic, Boston Scientific specific.
Interesting. Yeah, we're currently overweight biotech. It's been net additive to the strategy year to date, and we're also incorporating SSR's FDUFA model, which is a proprietary model that you and your colleagues have developed over the years to provide what I describe as a more risk-controlled methodology to get exposure to biotech. Maybe you can just describe that at a high level.
Yeah, absolutely. So PDUFA just means prescription drug user fee action date. So when a company files for approval, generally there's a predetermined time and a date on which the FDA is going to render a regulatory opinion. There are exploitable trading patterns from the time they file for approval and the regulatory action date. And we've looked at every instance of a company filing a product that is meaningful to their equity and how that equity performs over time. And we just exploit that proprietary knowledge. The simpler way to think about it is rather than choosing one or two biotech companies because they are so volatile, so we hold a portfolio of biotech companies within the broader healthcare portfolio. And as we've seen, as you guys have done with your own internal back testing, the relative performance gains are substantial, and it is actually a less volatile position in aggregate than holding even the Russell or the S&P Biotech Index or NASDAQ Biotech Indexes.
Yeah, excellent. Well, this has been, I think, very informative when we talk about the areas where we're exposed in the portfolio, pharma, biotech, life science tools, medical devices, underweight managed care. I think this kind of supports how we're positioned currently. As I like to say, I don't believe healthcare is a three-stock strategy. It's not like you can just own UNH or J&J or Pfizer, because from time to time, even those what we thought were kind of bulletproof companies can run into problems. So an actively managed, more holistic, diversified approach, we think makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much, Richard. Appreciate the ongoing guidance and views on the sector. And thank you, everybody, for dialing in today. If you do have any questions after the fact, feel free to reach out to anyone on our team and we'll be quick to get back to you. Thank you. Have a great day.